Welcome back to the channel, history friends. Today, we're doing something special. Today, we're talking about a group of people who, in your imagination, probably look like this. Bearded men with horned helmets, screaming Odin while slaughtering Christian monks and burning down monasteries. Yeah, let's just forget that completely. The Vikings, as they never called themselves, are one of the most misunderstood peoples in all of history. And the crazy thing, they shaped Europe more than almost any other group of the Middle Ages. Without them, there'd be no Russia as we know it, no Normandy, no England in its modern form. Hell, they even discovered America 500 years before Columbus. But let me tell you something. The story of the Vikings isn't the story of brainless barbarians. It's the story of brilliant sailors, ruthless businessmen, poetic warriors, and ultimately, of people who realized it's far more profitable to play Duke than to play Raider. We'll begin in the misty fjords of Scandinavia, more than 1,200 years ago. We'll see how these people launched the first true revolution of maritime trade, how they terrorized Europe and then became part of it, how they founded the Kievan Rus, how they sailed to Greenland and reached North America, and most importantly, we'll understand why they did it. A quick warning before we start. This story is complicated. There are no easy answers. The Vikings weren't good or evil. They were people of their time, making brutal choices in a brutal world. Sometimes we'll admire them. Sometimes we'll be horrified. And one more thing. Forget everything you've seen in Vikings or Marvel movies. The reality is so much more interesting. Strap in. This is going to be a ride. Let's start with a simple question. Where the hell did the Vikings actually come from? The answer is both simple and complicated. Simple, Scandinavia. Complicated, a Scandinavia you wouldn't even recognize. Picture it. Norway, 8th century. 75% of the land? Mountains. Steep, harsh, unforgiving mountains. Sweden? Roughly the same percentage, but forest. And not those romantic German forests you can stroll through on a Sunday afternoon. No! We're talking dense, swampy, endless primeval woods, where you'd probably break your neck if you weren't careful. And Jutland? The only land bridge to the continent? Cut off from the rest of Europe by vast bogs. Practically an island. Here's the thing. Modern, cozy, wealthy Scandinavia, with its tidy cities and high quality of life, that's the product of centuries of hard work. Back in the early Middle Ages, Scandinavia was, well, let's politely call it the ass end of the world. People didn't live everywhere. They couldn't. The population clustered in tiny, habitable pockets, mostly around Roskilde, southern Sweden, and the Oslo fjord. That's it. That was civilization. And here, listen closely because this is crucial. Here begins the first big lesson about the Vikings. If you wanted to travel in Scandinavia, you didn't walk. You sailed. The fjords, those deep inlets cutting into the land, weren't geographical curiosities. They were highways. The only way to get from A to B without sinking into a swamp or falling off a cliff. The Vikings didn't become seafarers because they loved the sea. They became seafarers because they had no damn choice. But who were these people, originally? The first humans arrived here about 8,000 years ago,
following the retreat of the Ice Age glaciers. Why would anyone move that far north? Simple. They were following reindeer. Here's something interesting. For Stone Age hunters, it was often easier to follow the herd wherever it went than to reinvent their entire toolkit for hunting a different animal. New weapons, new tactics, new knowledge. Too complicated. So they followed the reindeer into Scandinavia, and they stayed. For thousands of years, they were hunter-gatherers. Then, around 2300 BCE, something pivotal happened. The people of the battle axe culture arrived from the south. These newcomers, likely the first Proto-Germanic people, brought new technologies. But more importantly, they brought a language that would one day evolve into every Germanic tongue. German, English, Dutch, Norwegian, all of it traces back to these folks. They mixed with the locals. They began herding animals because farming in Scandinavia was nearly impossible. Too little fertile soil, too many rocks, too short summers. And right there, in this harsh, unforgiving corner of Europe, a culture slowly began to form. A culture that would one day turn the world upside down. Now here's one of my favorite facts. You know Vikings didn't actually wear horned helmets, right? That's a 19th century myth, thanks to Richter Wagner's operas. But horned helmets did exist in Scandinavia, just about 1500 years before the Viking Age. During the Bronze Age, Scandinavians copied Celtic technology, including ritual helmets with horns. No one wore those in battle. That would have been suicidal. But for ceremonies? Absolutely. Here's the problem. Scandinavia had no copper or tin, the metals you need for bronze. Everything had to be imported. That made the region technologically backward. While the South blossomed with magnificent bronze cultures, Scandinavia was, well, let's politely call it poor. But they did have something everyone wanted: amber. Tons of it. And to the Celts and later the Romans, amber was worth its weight in gold. So they traded. Fish, furs, amber, woodwork, anything they could squeeze from their meager resources. And even then, long before the Viking Age, groups of Scandinavians were already leaving home, heading south. Take the Goths, for example. They originally came from Scandinavia, migrated south around the time of Christ, and ended up in the Crimean Peninsula. Yeah, the Crimea. That's not close to Scandinavia. That's the Black Sea, people. Remember that, because when people later ask, how could the Vikings possibly reach the Volga River? The answer is, their ancestors had already gone farther 1,000 years earlier. The Viking Age wasn't an anomaly. It was the continuation of an ancient pattern. Scandinavia was crowded, poor, and harsh. So people left, again and again and again. But something was still missing: a technology, a revolution. And that arrived in the 7th century.
Picture this. You're a Scandinavian trader in the year 650. You want to sell your amber and furs. Problem? You've got a terrible boat. I mean it. The ships the Germanic peoples used back then were basically Celtic hand-me-downs, a wooden frame stretched with animal hides. These things, how shall we put it? They floated, sort of, but they were awful. You could paddle along the coast, maybe, if the weather was good and you were feeling lucky. An expedition? Forget it. A trade route? Don't make me laugh. And here comes the plot twist of history. The dominant trading power of the early Middle Ages wasn't Scandinavia. It was the Frisians. The Frisians, a people from what's now the Netherlands, had better ships and controlled Northern Europe's trade. They sailed between England, Scandinavia, and the Frankish Empire. They were the FedEx of the Middle Ages. And the Scandinavians? They sat in their fjords, watching, jealous. But then, sometime in the 7th century, Scandinavian shipbuilders started to experiment. The birth of the dragon ship. Let me tell you what made a Viking ship, a true longship, so revolutionary. First, the keel. Around 700 CE, Scandinavians developed a central keel, a long wooden spine running the length of the ship, giving it stability. Sounds simple, but it was groundbreaking, because the keel allowed for one critical addition, a mast and a sail. Suddenly, you didn't need 30 men rowing like slaves. You could harness the wind. You could be fast. Second, clinker construction. The planks overlapped slightly, like roof shingles. That gave the hull flexibility. Viking ships literally bent with the waves. Modern reconstructions show they moved like serpents. That was intentional. It distributed stress, preventing the ship from breaking apart in stormy seas. Third, the shallow draft. A Viking ship could sail in less than a meter of water, even a 20-meter-long vessel with 50 men aboard. Do you know what that means? It means you could drag the thing right up onto a beach. No docks, no harbors. You sail in, jump out, pull the boat onto the sand, done. And more importantly, you could sail up rivers, deep into the interior. Imagine you're a Frankish farmer in the year 840. You live 50 kilometers from the coast, beside a quiet river. You feel safe. Then one morning, 3 ships appear out of nowhere. Men with axes jump out. You had no warning, no time to prepare, nothing. That was the true power of the Viking ship, mobility and surprise. Fourth, reversibility. Viking ships were symmetrical. Bow and stern looked almost identical. Why? Because they didn't need to turn around. You could just row backward. Picture it. You raid a village. Suddenly, a local army shows up. No panic. You run to the ship, jump in, and row backward out to sea. In seconds, you're gone. It wasn't just a boat. It was a military superweapon. Now, we need to distinguish. There wasn't one Viking ship. There were 2 main types. The drakkar, the longship, that's the iconic warship. Long, sleek, fast. Room for up to 60 to 80 warriors. Often decorated with a carved dragon head on the prow, hence the name. But very little cargo space. This wasn't a trading vessel. It was a strike craft, a lightning-fast boat built for raids. The knar, the merchant ship, wider, deeper, more stable. Crew of maybe 15 to 20 men, but could carry 40 to 50 tons of cargo. That was the real workhorse, and, crucially, those were the ships that carried Vikings to Iceland, Greenland, and even America. A drakkar would have never made the trip. By around 750 CE, the Scandinavians had the best ships in Northern Europe. And just 50 years later, around 800, the raids began. That is not a coincidence. Imagine this. You suddenly possess a tool that gives you overwhelming military advantage. You can travel faster than any army. You can appear anywhere. You can vanish before anyone reacts. What would you do? Exactly. But here's the thing. The Vikings didn't become raiders because they were evil. They became raiders because they saw an opportunity. And to understand what kind of opportunity that was, we need to look at what was happening in Europe at that exact moment.
The year is 800. Charlemagne is crowned emperor in Rome.
The Carolingian Empire stretches from Spain all the way to Saxony. Monasteries and towns are thriving. The church is rich. From a Scandinavian perspective, it looked something like this. Wait a minute. The people down south have cities with churches full of gold, and they're undefended? Interesting. Here's the paradox. The early Middle Ages did have armies. Charlemagne's Franks were a formidable military power. Heavy infantry, cavalry, fortifications. But, and this is the key, those armies were built for land wars. No one had a navy. Why? Because no one needed one. Threats came from the land. The Huns came from the land. The Avars came from the land. Even the Arabs, okay, partly by sea, but that was way down south, far from Scandinavia. The coasts of France, England, Ireland, practically undefended. Why station troops there? Who the hell would attack over the sea? Yeah, dumb question. The year 793. The island monastery of Lindisfarne off the northeast coast of England. Lindisfarne was an important religious center. Monks copied manuscripts, prayed, lived in peace. For its time, it was wealthy. Golden crosses, ornate Bibles, silver chalices. And it was completely unprotected. On June 8, 793, ships appeared. The monks probably thought they were traders, maybe pilgrims. Instead, armed men jumped out, speaking a language no one understood. What happened next is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. In this year, terrible portents appeared over Northumbria and frightened the people. Mighty flashes of lightning, fiery dragons in the air, and soon after came a great famine, and the heathens destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. The monks were butchered, the church looted, everything of value taken, the buildings set ablaze. From the Vikings' point of view, it was a logical raid, an unguarded target, rich reward, in fast, out fast. From the Christians' point of view, it was the beginning of the apocalypse. The English scholar Alcuin wrote in a letter, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from this pagan people. That such destruction could come from across the sea was not thought possible." They were right to be afraid, because Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Let's be honest, the Vikings were raiders, and raiders kill, plunder, and rape. That's historical reality. But, and listen closely, that didn't make them unique. Every medieval army did the same. The Crusaders did it. The Mongols did it. The armies of the Reconquista did it. What made the Vikings unique wasn't their brutality. It was their mobility. They could strike places no one else could reach and vanish before anyone could respond. Picture this. You're a Viking leader. Let's call you Halfdan. You've got 40 men, 2 ships. You sail along the coast of France. You spot a monastery, unguarded. You go ashore. An hour later, you've got 3 chests of silver, 10 slaves, and a few golden crosses. A Frankish army hears about it. They march out. 3 days later, they arrive. You're already 100 kilometers down the coast, planning your next raid. What's the army supposed to do? Swim after you? That was the genius and the horror of the Viking strategy. They weren't stronger than Europe's armies. They were faster. A common question. Why did the Vikings attack churches and monasteries so often? Was it religious hatred? No. It was economic logic. Churches and monasteries were the wealthiest institutions in early medieval Europe. They collected tithes, stored relics made of gold and silver. They were basically banks without guards.
A Viking didn't see a church as a holy place. He saw a safe without a lock. And remember, the Vikings were pagans. To them, a Christian cross meant nothing. It was just gold in an interesting shape, perfect for melting down or wearing as jewelry. Christian chroniclers were horrified to see Vikings drinking from sacred chalices. But to the Vikings, it made perfect sense. It's a cup. Why not drink from it? And here begins a pattern that would define the next 200 years. The Vikings appear, they raid, they vanish. The Christians pray for deliverance. The Vikings return. And with every raid, they grew bolder, and more numerous, and more organized. By around 830, the raids weren't sporadic anymore. They were annual. Every summer, they came. Like a clockwork, like a natural disaster you could see coming, but couldn't stop. Europe had a problem, and that problem had a name. Vikinger.
Okay, let's take a moment and clear up a basic question. Who were the Vikings, really? And here's where things get complicated. First of all, Viking wasn't a people. It was a profession, or more precisely, an activity. The Old Norse word, vikinger, probably meant something like someone who goes on a raid, or someone who does Viking, as in goes off on a plundering voyage. Picture this. You're a young Scandinavian in the year 850. It's winter. You're sitting on your small farm in Norway, tending goats, fixing your roof. Boring, but necessary. Then, one spring, a neighbor stops by. Halfdan and I are planning a trip to Ireland. We need a few more men. You coming? You think about it. There's not much to do at home, and last season, Halfdan came back loaded. Yeah, I'm in. You set sail. You raid a few villages. With some luck, you come back with silver, weapons, maybe a few slaves. By autumn, you're home again. Congratulations, you were a Viking. Next year, you might stay home. Then, you're not a Viking anymore. Being a Viking wasn't an identity. It was a seasonal job. Another problem. During the Viking Age, there were no Danes, Norwegians, or Swedes in the modern sense. Those nations didn't exist yet. There were different regions, different rulers, different dialects. But culturally, they were almost identical. They spoke variations of the same language, Old Norse. They worshipped the same gods, built the same ships, shared the same warrior culture. The Franks just called them all Nordmanni, Northmen. The Anglo-Saxons called them Dene, Danes, no matter where they came from. The Slavs and Byzantines called them Rus or Varangians. There were tendencies, sure. People from what's now Norway sailed west to Scotland, Ireland, Iceland. People from Denmark focused on England and France. People from Sweden, especially from Gotland, sailed east into the Baltics and Russia. But those weren't strict boundaries. A Norwegian could just as easily end up in Constantinople. A Swede could die in Ireland. The Viking world was supranational. They all belonged to the same cultural sphere. So, how was Scandinavian society organized? Not tribal like the Stone Age, not yet feudal like later Europe, something in between, a prestige society. What does that mean? It means power wasn't based on land or formal titles. It was based on reputation, wealth, and loyalty. Picture this. You're a leader, a jarl, a local chieftain. You have no legal claim to power, no divine kingship, no hereditary monarchy, at least not yet. Your authority comes from men who choose to follow you. Why do they follow you? Because you're brave. You lead successful raids. Generous. You share the loot fairly. Wealthy. You can afford better weapons, armor, jewelry. Eloquent. You can speak well, tell stories, inspire men. Your claim to leadership was fragile. If you stopped succeeding, stopped bringing home loot, or lost a battle, your followers left. They'd follow someone else. It was a system with brutally high performance pressure. Now you understand why the Vikings were so obsessed with risk. A young Scandinavian had basically two options. Option A, stay home, tend your goats, farm your tiny plot in an overcrowded fjord. Be poor. Be nobody. Option B, go on a voyage, risk your life, but if you survive and succeed, you come back with silver, weapons, slaves, maybe even a foreign wife. Suddenly, you're someone. People respect you. You might even buy your own land. Which option sounds more attractive to an 18-year-old full of testosterone and ambition? And here's the kicker. Even if you die, that's okay. Because according to their religion, the Vikings didn't believe in a pleasant afterlife for everyone. Their afterlife was tiered. If you died in bed of old age or sickness, you went to Helheim, the realm of Hel, daughter of Loki. Cold, dark, dreary. Not torment like the Christian hell, just endless boredom. But if you died in battle, oh, that's when things got interesting. Half the fallen warriors went to Valhalla, Odin's great hall. There, you'd feast every night with the greatest warriors of all time. You'd fight by day, and if you died, you'd just stand up again by evening. Drink mead and eat the flesh of a magical boar that regenerated every night. Basically, the Norse version of paradise was an endless party for hooligans. The other half went to Freya's realm, Folkvanger, also a solid option. And here's something remarkable. Women who died in childbirth could also enter Valhalla. That was considered just as honorable a death as dying in combat. That says a lot about the respect women held in this society, at least in religious terms. So, if you were a Viking, why fear death? Dying in battle was the best thing that could happen to you. Dying in bed was shameful. That explains a lot about their appetite for danger. And then there were the berserkers. The word berserker probably means bear shirt, warriors who wore bear pelts. These men were famous for entering a battle frenzy, a kind of psychotic trance where they felt no pain, roared with rage, and fought with no regard for their own lives. Modern theories wonder, were they on drugs? Mushrooms? Alcohol? Probably not. The sources say it themselves. A berserker who goes into battle drunk is an idiot. You'd lose coordination. You'd die instantly. No, the berserker state was likely self-induced psychosis. Through hyperventilation, meditation, war chants, they hacked their own nervous systems into overdrive. In modern terms, they biohacked themselves into fury. Was it effective? Absolutely. A screaming warrior, seemingly immune to pain, charging straight at you. That's terrifying. Psychological warfare at its finest. But there were downsides. Berserkers were hard to control. Sometimes they attacked their own allies. And after battle, they were completely drained. Still, they became legends, and they amplified the Vikings' reputation as superhuman warriors, which of course was nonsense. But reputation is everything.
Now things get interesting, because here's the uncomfortable truth about the Vikings. They weren't primarily warriors. They were businessmen. And their business model was simple. Maximize profit, minimize risk. Sounds boring? Just wait. A Viking leader had three main sources of income: 1. Trade. The boring but steady option. You sail to a trading hub, say Dorestad in Frisia or Hedeby, Denmark. You sell your furs, your amber, your walrus ivory. You buy weapons, wine, jewelry. Then you sail home. Profit, moderate. Risk, low. 2. Tribute. The Danegeld. Now it gets clever. You sail with your fleet to the coast of a rich region. You start raiding a few villages. Then you wait. Sooner or later, a messenger from the local king or duke shows up. Please stop attacking us. We'll pay you. You negotiate. They pay, let's say, 5,000 pounds of silver. You sail away. Profit? High. Risk? Almost zero. You don't even have to fight. That's organized crime, but legal. Because who's going to sue you? 3. Plunder. The risky but potentially most lucrative option. You hit an undefended target, a monastery, a town, a village. You take everything of value. Profit? Very high, if successful. Risk? High, if you meet resistance. And here's the genius part. These 3 pillars were interchangeable. Imagine this. You're a Viking jarl named Ragnar. Yeah, I know, cliché, but go with it. You're sailing up the Seine with 3 ships and 120 men. Your plan is to trade in Rouen. On the way, you spot a poorly defended monastery. Quick cost-benefit analysis. Anyone around who can stop you? No. Does the place look rich? Yes. Do you have time? Also yes. Decision? Raid it. 1 hour later, you've got 3 chests of silver, 10 slaves, and some golden crosses. Cost? 0. Casualties? 0. You continue to Rouen, sell the slaves, melt down the gold, buy Frankish swords. On the way home, a Frankish patrol ambushes you. You fight them off, thanks to your new swords. You lose 1 man. No problem. You dock further north, visit a local nobleman. Listen, you say, we've got 100 men. Either you pay us 1,000 silver pieces or we burn your fields. The nobleman pays. Of course he does. You sail home. Your investment, 1 man. Your profit, thousands of silver coins, weapons, and prestige. Next year, you do it again. And the year after that. And the year after that. And every year more men join you. Because everyone knows sailing with Ragnar means profit. That's the business model. And it worked damn well. Now we have to talk about something unpleasant. Slavery. The Vikings were massive slave traders. That wasn't a side business, it was core business. Why? Because the Islamic world in the 9th and 10th centuries had an enormous demand for slaves. Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, cities with hundreds of thousands, even over 1 million inhabitants, constantly needed new labor. The Vikings supplied them. From 3 main sources: Ireland and Britain, Celtic and Anglo-Saxon captives; Slavic lands, Eastern Europe. In fact, the English word slave comes from Slav. And Finno-Ugric peoples from the Baltic and northern Russia. The route was often along the Volga or the Dnieper rivers to the Khazars or Volga Bulgars, who acted as middlemen. From there, the slaves went to the Islamic world. A 10th century Arab chronicler, Ibn Fadlan, described a Viking caravan along the Volga. He was fascinated and disgusted by their behavior, but he confirmed they brought dozens of slaves. And here's the cynical part. A fair-haired Slavic or Irish woman could be bought in Scandinavia for 70 silver dirhams and sold in Baghdad for 3,000. That's a profit margin of over 4,000%. No wonder they did it. I'm not here to preach. Slavery was universal in the Middle Ages. Arabs practiced it. Byzantines practiced it. Christians practiced it. The Vikings were no exception. But they were particularly good at it because they had the logistics, the ships, the networks. It's important to understand this. The Viking Age wasn't just an age of heroic exploration and epic battles. It was also an age of industrialized human trafficking. Both are true, and both are part of the story.
Okay, back to the main narrative. We've been talking about the Vikings as if they were the only players, but they weren't. In the first half of the 8th century, the dominant trading power in northern Europe wasn't the Vikings, it was the Frisians. The Frisians, from what's now the Netherlands and northwestern Germany, controlled trade across the North Sea. They had trading hubs, like Dorestad, one of the largest cities north of the Alps. For decades, the Frisians were the middlemen. If Scandinavians wanted to trade, they had to go through Frisian merchants. But then, the Vikings developed better ships, and suddenly, they didn't need middlemen anymore. Around 820, the Vikings began entering Frisian territory directly, not just to trade, but to take over. Dorestad was raided again and again, 834, 835, 836, 837. Every year they returned. Every year they took more. The Frisians tried to resist. They had an army, but their ships were hopelessly inferior. A Frisian trade ship could carry maybe 20 men. A Viking longship? 60 to 80. And it was faster. That's like pitting a delivery truck against a sports car. Technically, both are vehicles. Practically, no contest. By 860, Dorestad was effectively dead. The trade routes the Frisians had dominated for centuries were now firmly in Viking hands. The Frisians were merchants, only merchants. The Vikings were merchants and warriors. They could switch roles whenever they wanted. Picture this. A Frisian trader arrives at a Slavic village to buy furs. He negotiates, he pays, he leaves peacefully. A Viking arrives at the same village. He says, "Sell us your furs or we'll take them." Which offer would you accept? That was their edge. The Vikings didn't just offer trade, they offered protection from themselves. In modern terms, that's called an extortion business model. In the Middle Ages, it was just called normal business. The fall of the Frisians created a power vacuum in northern European trade, and the Vikings filled it completely. By the end of the 9th century, they controlled almost every major northern trade route. The North Sea, Vikings. The Baltic, Vikings. The Russian rivers, Vikings. The Irish Sea, Vikings. But here's the irony. The more successful the Vikings became as merchants, the less they needed to raid. Trade was stable, predictable, less risky. A raided village gives you one payday. A trade network gives you income every year. The Vikings got richer by becoming more civilized. And that leads us to one of the most fascinating chapters in their story, their expansion into the geopolitical world of the East.
While their brothers in the West were terrorizing England and France, another group of Vikings, mainly from modern-day Sweden, was doing something far more ambitious. They were building a transcontinental trade network. From the Baltic Sea to the Caspian Sea, from Scandinavia to Baghdad. That's not exaggeration. Viking swords have been found in Persia. Tens of thousands of Arab silver coins have been unearthed in Swedish graves. So how the hell did they pull that off? The answer: rivers. Eastern Europe is laced with massive river systems. The Volga flows to the Caspian Sea, the Dnieper to the Black Sea, the Daugava to the Baltic. And here's the genius. At certain points, Those rivers run just 10 to 20 kilometers apart. What does that mean? Portage. You drag your ships overland from one river to the next. Yes, it's brutal work. Yes, it takes days, but it's possible. And Viking ships, light, shallow, under a ton in weight, were perfect for it. Let me paint you a picture. You start in the Baltic, sail up the Daugava, portage to the Dnieper, sail down the Dnieper, reach the Black Sea. Destination? Constantinople. Or take the Volga, reach the Caspian Sea. Destination? Baghdad. The first Vikings to head east encountered a world totally unlike the West. No helpless monasteries here, but empires, powerful, organized states. The Khazars, a Turkic people ruling a vast realm between the Caucasus and the Volga. Main religion? Judaism. Yes, really. The Volga Bulgars, Muslim traders controlling the Volga River. Finno-Ugric tribes, hunter-gatherers in today's Russia, Finland, and the Baltics. Slavic tribes, spreading rapidly across Eastern Europe. The Vikings couldn't just show up and raid here. These people had armies, fortified cities. So the Vikings did something smarter. They offered their services. And here, the story becomes legend. According to the primary chronicle, written in the 11th century, so take it with caution, the Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes in northwestern Russia were constantly at war. Eventually, they supposedly said, "Screw it, let's bring someone from outside to rule us." So they invited the Varangians, the Eastern Vikings, to come and govern. That's the official story, the legend of the calling of the Varangians. Was it true? Probably not. They likely just saw an opportunity and took it. But here's what we do know. Around 860, Byzantine sources mention a people called the Rus. They attacked Constantinople, coming from the north via the rivers, and they were unmistakably Scandinavian. Their leaders' names were Norse, their weapons Norse, their ships Norse. The word Rus is debated. The most accepted theory comes from the Finnish word ruotsi, meaning rowers or Swedes. The Slavs adopted it. The Byzantines adopted it. And eventually, Rus became the name of the entire region. Yes, Russia owes its name to the Vikings. Controversial? Oh yes, especially among modern nationalists. But the evidence is strong. The Vikings founded or took over several key trading posts. Staraya Ladoga, on the Volkhov River north of Lake Ladoga. Scandinavian artifacts date back to around 750. Novgorod, Holmgard, south of Lake Ilmen, a major crossroads. Kiev, Kienogard, on the Dnieper, the key link between north and south. These weren't colonies in the modern sense. They were fortified trading outposts, small Norse settlements surrounded by Slavic and Finno-Ugric populations. And very quickly, they began to blend. Here's the fascinating part. In the West, in England or France, Vikings took 2 to 3 generations to assimilate. In the East, even faster. Why? Because in the East, they were vastly outnumbered. In England, thousands of Danes could settle. In Normandy, hundreds. In the East, maybe a few dozen per outpost. They had to cooperate with the Slavs. They had to marry Slavic women. Their children grew up bilingual. Within 100 years, the Rus were culturally more Slavic than Scandinavian. But, and this is key, The leadership remained Norse for a long time, and so did the trade networks. And then, finally, they reached Constantinople. Visualize it. You're a Viking from a village of 200 people. The biggest city you've ever seen has maybe 5,000. You sail down the Dnieper, through deadly rapids, into the Black Sea. And then you see this. Constantinople. 500,000 inhabitants, massive walls, the Hagia Sophia, its dome glittering in the sun, marble palaces, churches of gold. It must have looked like another world. And here, in Constantinople, the Vikings learned something crucial. Power doesn't only come from the sword. It comes from civilization.
Constantinople posed a problem. England, raid. France, raid. Ireland, easy. But Constantinople? It had the Theodosian walls, triple lines, towers every 50 meters, the strongest fortifications on Earth, and a navy wielding Greek fire, medieval napalm that burned on water. Vikings tried in 860, 907, 941, and were repelled. A Byzantine chronicler paraphrased, "Barbarians from the north came in little boats. We burned them. The end." So the Vikings pivoted. We can't take this city, but we can work for it. Byzantium's constant problem, treachery. Court plots, coups, usurpers. Regular troops had loyalties to generals, nobles, factions. Vikings? No local ties, barely any Greek, no claim to the throne. Perfect bodyguards. Around 988 CE, under Basil II, the Varangian Guard becomes official, an elite unit of Scandinavians, later also Anglo-Saxons. Mission? Protect the emperor. Period. Pay? Legendary. Several times a regular's wage, with rich victory bonuses. Best perk? On the emperor's death, Varangians could enter the treasury once and take as much gold as they could carry. The politacile. 10 years, emperor dies, you load up gold, sail home rich. No wonder volunteers lined up. Example? Harald Hardrada, the Hard, a Norwegian prince forced into exile. He went to Constantinople and joined the Guard. He served 15 years, fought in Italy, Sicily, Bulgaria, the Holy Land, and grew immensely wealthy. He returned to Norway, became king, and waged wars across Scandinavia and England. 1066, remember the date. Harold tried to conquer England. He landed with a vast army in Yorkshire, lost, and was killed at Stamford Bridge. 3 weeks later, William the Conqueror, a Norman, i.e., an assimilated Viking, landed in southern England and won at Hastings. Pause. 1066, the year 2 Viking armies tried to take England. One failed, the other succeeded. Time in Constantinople changed the Vikings profoundly. They saw a Christian civilization that wasn't weak. It was rich, powerful, sophisticated, with art, architecture, literature, and a working bureaucracy. Until then, Vikings mostly associated Christianity with helpless monks being slaughtered. But in Byzantium, Christian warriors with better gear, organization, and, shockingly, better strategy. The Byzantines didn't fight like berserkers. They fought with discipline, planning, logistics. That impressed the Vikings. Many Varangians who returned to Scandinavia or Rus brought back more than gold. They brought back ideas about statehood, administration, religion. And those ideas were central to Christianization and state building in both Scandinavia and the Rus. Around 988, the same year the Guard is formalized, Prince Vladimir of Kiev is baptized. A classic Varangian Rus ruler,
Old Norse name, Old Norse Valdemar, but already heavily Slavicized, ruling from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Why convert? The primary chronicle tells a neat story. Vladimir invited envoys of various faiths, Muslim, Jewish, Catholic, Orthodox. The Muslims rejected for banning alcohol. Vladimir allegedly said, "Drinking is the joy of the Rus. We cannot live without it." Legend? Probably, but with a truth. Mead and beer were central to the culture. Prohibition was a non-starter. Orthodoxy had no such ban, plus an alliance with Byzantium meant trade, military backing, and prestige. Vladimir was baptized, then baptized his people, by force if necessary. Rus became Christian, beginning the transformation from a loose Viking trade network into a state.
While the Rus were taking shape in the east, something even more dramatic was happening in the west. England was flooded, not by water, by Vikings. The early raids, Lindisfarne 793, scattered coastal attacks, were just the beginning. From 835 onward, things got serious. The number of raids exploded. And then, in 865, something new arrived. The Great Heathen Army. This was no raid. This was an invasion. Estimates run from 2,000 to 3,000 men, enormous for the time, with several hundred ships. Led by legendary names, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Ube. Their goal? Not hit and run. They wanted land, permanently. England, then, wasn't a unified country. It was several kingdoms, Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the middle, East Anglia in the east, Wessex in the south. These kingdoms hated each other almost as much as they hated the Vikings. The Great Heathen Army exploited that ruthlessly, playing one against another, offering alliances, breaking them, staying flexible. 866, York falls. Northumbria collapses. 869, East Anglia is overrun, King Edmund is captured and, according to legend, tied to a tree and riddled with arrows for refusing to abandon Christianity. He was later canonized. That didn't help him at the time. 870s, Mercia falls. The Vikings now controlled 2/3 of England. Only one kingdom remained, Wessex. King Alfred of Wessex, later called the Great, was the last hope. And honestly, it looked grim. In 878, Wessex was overrun by a fresh Viking wave. Alfred fled to the marshes of Somerset, hiding and gathering a small band of loyal warriors. The Vikings thought they'd won. Dumb assumption. Alfred reorganized his forces. He built a network of fortified towns, burhs, as defensive hubs. He reformed the army. And, the masterstroke, he built a fleet. Alfred realized you can't beat Vikings by chasing them over land. You have to meet them at sea. His ships weren't as good as Viking craft, but good enough to defend harbors and intercept fleets. In 878, at the Battle of Edington, Alfred dealt the Great Heathen Army a decisive defeat. But, and this matters, he didn't annihilate them. Alfred was pragmatic. He knew he couldn't expel the Vikings from England. There were too many, too entrenched. So he made a deal. The Vikings keep the territories they already control, roughly everything east of a line from London to Chester. But they must be baptized. Their leader Guthrum becomes Alfred's Christian son, symbolically, and they may no longer attack Wessex. The area under Viking control became known as the Danelaw, that is, the land under Danish law. It's like saying today, okay, invaders can keep half the country, but they have to promise to be nice. And it worked. Sort of. The Danelaw wasn't a homogeneous Viking territory. It was a patchwork of Norse settlements and Anglo-Saxon villages. The Vikings founded or took over towns. York, Jorvik, became a major Viking trade city. Derby, Nottingham, Leicester, Lincoln, Stamford, the 5 boroughs, key Viking strongholds. And then something fascinating happened. Assimilation. Vikings married Anglo-Saxon women. Their children grew up bilingual. Old Norse and Old English blended. Modern English is packed with Norse loanwords from this period. Sky, Old Norse sku. Egg, from Scandi egg, displacing Old English egg. They, them, their, fully Norse, displacing the Old English forms. Take, get, give, call, die, ugly, wrong, happy, all Norse. If you speak English, about 5 to 10% of what you say is Scandinavian. Within 2 to 3 generations, Vikings in the Danelaw were culturally Anglo-Saxon. They spoke English, they were Christians, they had English names. But, crucially, they kept Danish legal traditions. Danish law held in the Danelaw into the 11th century. Practically, that meant things like more flexible property rights for farmers, less serfdom, different inheritance rules. In some ways, the Danelaw was freer than the rest of England, enough that some Anglo-Saxons moved into it. The invaders became attractive neighbors. But the story wasn't over. In the 10th century came a new wave, even bigger.
While England fought for its life, France was no better off, arguably worse. After Charlemagne's death in 814, the Carolingian Empire began to fall apart. His sons fought each other, his grandsons too. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun split the realm into 3. West Francia, roughly modern France, East Francia, roughly modern Germany, and Middle Francia, a weird strip from Italy to the North Sea that soon vanished. None of these successor states was strong enough to defend itself. The Vikings noticed. The Seine is long, wide, navigable, straight into France's heart. On its banks, Rouen, and further upriver, Paris. For Vikings, the Seine was a gilded invitation. Come on in, everything's undefended. And they came. Oh, they came. In March 845, a fleet of 120 ships under a leader named Ragnar sailed up the Seine. Yes, Ragnar. Was it the Ragnar Lothbrok? Who knows? Sources are murky, but a chieftain named Ragnar was definitely there. King Charles the Bald tried to stop them, splitting his army to guard both riverbanks. Ragnar's answer? He attacked one side, crushed it, took 111 prisoners, and hanged them in sight of the other army. The other army deserted. They saw their comrades dangling and thought, screw this. Ragnar sailed on to Paris. King Charles the Bald paid 7,000 pounds of silver, the first Danegeld in France. The Vikings took the money and sailed away. And then, here's the kicker, 20 kilometers downstream, another Viking group raided a village, and another, and another. There was no central Viking command. Each crew did its own thing. The Danegeld you paid applied to only that group. The next crew? No deal. It was like paying protection when there are 10 different gangs. From 850 onward, France was hit annually.
The Vikings got bolder. 856, they overwintered in France for the first time, on an island in the Seine. They didn't go home. 860s, they began stealing horses and operating as cavalry. Suddenly, they could strike inland beyond the rivers. Yes, Vikings on horses. It breaks the cliché, but it's recorded. They didn't fight mounted. They rode to battle, dismounted, and fought on foot. It made them even more mobile. 885 to 886, the Great Siege of Paris. A fleet claimed at 700-plus ships, likely exaggerated, still massive, sailed up the Seine. 30,000 to 40,000 men, also inflated, but many. Paris was then a small city on the Ile de Cité, with 2 fortified bridges and strong walls. The Vikings besieged it for 13 months. Count Odo of Paris, the commander, became a hero, holding out against overwhelming odds. But in the end, the new king, Charles the Fat, yes, that was the official epithet, arrived with an army and instead of attacking, paid the Vikings 700 pounds of silver and let them sail upriver to Burgundy to plunder there. So cowardly that Charles was soon deposed. Odo became king, and under him, France finally started to fight back. The real solution came in 911. A Viking chieftain named Rollo, a giant of a man said to be too big for any horse, controlled the Seine's mouth. King Charles the Simple had an idea. What if we stop fighting the Vikings and make them fight for us? Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte, 911. Rollo gets the region around Rouen, Normandy, as his duchy. He becomes a vassal of the French king, in theory. He gets baptized, and, the key, he defends the Seine against other Vikings. Rollo accepted. And then, something extraordinary happened. Rollo and his men became Normans. Northmen, yes, but French Northmen. Within 1 generation, they spoke French. Within 2, they bore French names. Rollo's son, William Longsword, still half Norse. Rollo's grandson, Richard I, fully French. The Vikings who had terrorized Europe turned into French nobles? But they kept their edge and their ambition. Because 1066, remember? A descendant of Rollo, William the Conqueror, would take England. The Vikings weren't defeated. They were integrated and kept conquering under a new flag.
Ireland was a special case. Why? Because 9th century Ireland was politically shattered, more than England, more than France. No central authority, dozens of Celtic kingdoms, clans, and subclans hating each other. For Vikings, it was an all-you-can-raid buffet. From 795, raids began, mainly coastal, small groups, quick strikes. Irish monasteries, and Ireland was full of them, were incredibly rich. Golden reliquaries, ornate manuscripts, silver chalices, and practically undefended. The Vikings worked their way systematically along the coast, monastery by monastery. But from the 830s, something changed. They started to stay. In 841, Norwegian Vikings founded a permanent settlement at the mouth of the Liffey, Dub Linn, Black Pool, today Dublin. Dublin quickly became one of the most important Viking trade hubs, controlling the Irish Sea, with routes to Iceland, England, France, Scandinavia, and above all, a hub for shipping slaves. Irish slaves were especially valuable on European and Islamic markets. But the Irish weren't helpless. Unlike England or France, Irish kings had no qualms about allying with Vikings when it suited them, and they did, constantly. One Irish king would hire one Viking group against a rival Irish king. The rival would hire other Vikings.
Ireland became a proxy war between Celtic clans with Scandinavian mercenaries. 914 to 980s, near continuous wars, Vikings versus Irish, Vikings versus Vikings, Irish versus Irish, Vikings plus Irish versus other Vikings plus other Irish. Total chaos. Good Friday, 1014. On one side, Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, well, he claimed it, with an army of Irish and some allied Vikings. On the other, the Viking King of Dublin, Sigtryg Silkenbeard, with his Vikings plus Irish allies who hated Brian. Yes, Irish on both sides, Vikings on both sides. The battle was brutal. Thousands died. Brian Boru won the battle, but he himself was killed during the fight, reportedly in his tent while praying. The Vikings lost the battle, but not Dublin. They kept the city, living there for centuries more. As elsewhere, Vikings in Ireland assimilated quickly. Within 2 to 3 generations, they were Hiberno-Norse, half Irish, half Norse. They spoke Irish, converted to Christianity, married into Irish clans. Genetic studies show modern Icelanders have more Irish than Scandinavian DNA. Why? Because many of the Vikings who sailed to Iceland were actually Irish slaves or women brought by Vikings. Iceland, the supposedly purest Viking land, is genetically half Celtic. History is complicated, folks.
Iceland. An island of fire and ice, volcanoes and glaciers. No trees, no mammals except Arctic foxes, and, until the 9th century, no people. Well, almost. There were likely a few Irish monks who came as hermits, living in caves, praying, fasting, freezing. When Vikings arrived, the monks vanished quickly. Smart move. Around 870, systematic settlement began. Why go there? 2 main reasons. Land shortage in Scandinavia. Overcrowded. If you weren't the eldest son, you inherited nothing. Your options: become a Viking or emigrate. Political refugees. When Harald Fairhair, Harald Hårfagre, forcibly united Norway in the late 9th century, many nobles fled rather than surrender their independence. Iceland was perfect. Far away, no ruler, free land for the taking. Well, free is relative. Iceland was harsh. Picture the scene. No trees. That means no timber for houses, ships, furniture. Most had to be imported. Short summers, long brutal winters, thin soils. But there was grass, enough for sheep and cattle, and fish, tons of it. Icelanders became mainly herders and fishermen. And, crucially, they developed a unique social structure. No king, no central government. Instead, in 930, they founded the Althing, an annual assembly of all free men. There they made laws, settled disputes, arranged marriages, did business. The Althing is one of the oldest parliaments in the world. Not democratic in the modern sense, only free men, no slaves, no women, and the richest had the most sway. But remarkably egalitarian for the time. No king, no feudal nobility, only godar, local chieftains whom people followed voluntarily. Iceland was basically an anarcho-libertarian society, and, astonishingly, it worked for about 300 years. Iceland gave us something priceless. The Islendinga sagas, the Icelandic sagas. In the 13th century, Icelanders wrote their past, gathering oral traditions about first settlers, feuds, exploits. These sagas are our most detailed window into Viking life. Caution, written centuries later, blending fact and legend. Still, they are incredibly vivid. Feuds, love stories,
voyages, murders. Brutal, often funny, sometimes surprisingly psychological. Example, Njal's Saga, a famous tale of a family feud escalating over decades until almost everyone is dead. It's like Game of Thrones, only historical and with more sheep. In 1000 CE, Iceland neared a breaking point. Part of the population had become Christian, often via Norway. Another wanted the old gods. Tension threatened civil war. At the Althing of 1000, a compromise. Iceland would be officially Christian, but anyone could privately worship the old gods, just not publicly. Quintessentially Icelandic. Okay, we're Christian now, so Norway leaves us alone, but at home we do what we want. Within a few decades, paganism faded anyway.
Now it gets crazy. Because the Vikings, those insane bastards, didn't stop at Iceland. They kept sailing. Eric the Red, our protagonist, Eric Thorvaldsson, better known as Eric the Red. Why the red? Probably for his hair or his temper, likely both. Eric was a textbook Viking troublemaker. Born in Norway, his family had to flee to Iceland because his father had committed a murder. In Iceland, Eric committed murder too. More precisely, several murders. 980. Eric is banished from Iceland for 3 years for manslaughter. What do you do when you're banished from Iceland and have 3 years to kill? You go exploring. Eric had heard rumors. West of Iceland, there was land. Sailors blown off course had seen it. So Eric set out. Small ship, handful of men. The voyage was brutal. Roughly 900 kilometers across the open North Atlantic. Icebergs, storms, fog. But Eric found the land. Greenland. Now, Greenland isn't green. It's 80% ice. But, and this matters, in the late 9th century, it was the medieval climate optimum. Temperatures were about 1 to 2 degrees C warmer than today, meaning the southwestern fjords of Greenland were habitable. Grass grew. You could raise livestock. Hard, but possible. Eric explored the coast for 3 years. Then he returned to Iceland. Eric was a marketing genius. He could have said, "I found a frozen, hostile land where you'll probably die." Instead, he called it Grønland, Greenland, and he told everyone who would listen how fantastic it was. Quote from the saga, "He called the land Greenland, for he said people would be more likely to go there if the land had a pleasant name. The man invented greenwashing, literally. And it worked." 985. 25 ships with about 500 people sailed from Iceland to Greenland. Only 14 arrived. The rest were lost in storms, turned back, or vanished. Over 200 people died on the crossing. That was the reality of Viking expansion. For every success, dozens died. The survivors founded 2 settlements. Eastern Settlement. Actually, in the southwest, Viking navigation was confusing. Western Settlement, farther north on the west coast. At most, 2,000 to 5,000 people lived in Greenland at its peak. They raised sheep, goats, cattle. They hunted seals and walruses. They traded walrus ivory for timber, iron, and grain from Europe. But crucially, Greenland depended on imports. Almost no wood, no iron, no grain. Everything had to come from Iceland or Norway. That made Greenland incredibly vulnerable. The Vikings in Greenland encountered the Inuit, whom the Norse called skraelingar, probably barbarians or weaklings. The relationship was mixed. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they fought. Mostly,
They ignored each other. Archaeology shows the Norse did not adopt Inuit technologies. No kayaks, no full fur clothing, no Inuit hunting methods. That was stupid. The Inuit knew how to survive in the Arctic. The Vikings, not so much. Leif Erikson and Vinland. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, Eric the Red's son, sailed west from Greenland. Why? Because a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson had earlier reported drifting off course and sighting land west of Greenland. Leif wanted to find it, and he did. He landed at 3 places and named them: Helluland, Flat Stone Land, likely Baffin Island; Markland, Forest Land, likely Labrador; and Vinland, Wineland, likely Newfoundland. Yes, the Vikings reached North America around 1000 CE, almost 500 years before Columbus. This is not controversial. We have archaeological proof. In 1960, archaeologists in Newfoundland, Canada, uncovered the remains of a Norse site, Lons a Meadows, dated to about 1000 CE. 8 buildings, longhouses in classic Scandinavian style, a smithy, tools, unmistakably Norse. That's the proof. The Vikings were here. But the settlement was small, maybe 30 to 50 people, and it didn't last. 3 reasons. 1. The Skrælingr. The Norse also called the native peoples of North America Skrælingr, probably the Beothuk or other Algonquian groups. They were not pleased by the invaders. The sagas tell of clashes. The Vikings won some, but were hopelessly outnumbered. In one attack, a prominent Norseman, Thorvald Eriksson, Leif's brother, was killed by an arrow. The Vikings realized they could not settle here permanently, not without massive reinforcements. 2. The distance. Greenland to Vinland is about 2,500 kilometers. With medieval technology, that meant at least a week at sea in good weather. Reinforcements and supply from Iceland or Norway, almost impossible. And 3. Lack of incentive. Vinland had timber, great, and grapes, or berries suitable for wine. But compared to Europe, there was nothing especially valuable. No gold, no silver, no great civilizations to trade with or plunder. The Vikings could have colonized America, but why? Too far, too dangerous, too little profit. The end. After a few years, perhaps 10, 20, the Vikings abandoned Vinland. They returned to Greenland. They still sailed to Markland occasionally for timber, but permanent colonies? No. America remained forgotten for the next 500 years, until Columbus came. And, unlike the Vikings, Columbus had better ships, backers among powerful kingdoms, and crucially, he found civilizations with gold. The Vikings discovered America, but they did not colonize it. That's an important difference.
So, we're in the 11th century. The Vikings have terrorized Europe, founded realms, discovered America. And then, they stopped being Vikings. What happened? The 3 reasons for the end. 1. Christianization. From the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the Scandinavian kingdoms were systematically Christianized. Denmark, King Harald Bluetooth, yes, the tech is named after him, was baptized around 960. Norway, Olaf Tryggvason, and later Olaf the Holy, enforced conversion, often brutally. Sweden took longer, but by 1100 it was largely Christian. Why did it matter? Because Christianity undermined the ideology of Viking raiding. Old religion, dying in battle is honorable. Valhalla awaits. Christianity, murder is a sin. Plunder is a sin. Hell awaits. Suddenly, raiding looked less attractive. Also, Christian kings couldn't just raid other Christian lands, politically toxic. Viking raiding worked when you were a pagan hitting Christians. Once you became Christian yourself, the business model collapsed. 2. State formation. In the 11th century, real kingdoms formed in Scandinavia. Denmark, under Canute the Great, r. 1016 to 35, became a North Sea empire, ruling Denmark, England, and Norway. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark centralized under kings who asserted control. And kings don't like independent war bands freelancing raids. A king says, if anyone plunders here, it's me. You join my army, or you go to prison. The end of the Viking Age was the end of freebooting. Violence got monopolized by the state. 3. European defense. Europe learned how to deal with Vikings. Castles. From the 10th century on, Europe sprouted stone fortresses Vikings couldn't crack. Fleets. England under Alfred and his successors built a navy. France too. Suddenly, Viking fleets could be intercepted before landfall. Fortified bridges. Rivers, the Vikings' highways, were blocked with fortified spans. Viking raids became unprofitable, risk too high, return too low. So people stopped going a Viking. But there was one last hurrah. 1066, the year of 3 battles. England, ruled by Edward the Confessor, saw him die in January 1066 without a direct heir. 3 men claimed the throne. Harold Godwinson, English earl, chosen by the English elite. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, Varangian veteran, a fearsome warrior. William of Normandy, Duke of Normandy, distant kin to Edward. All 3 were ready to fight. September 1066, Harold Hardrada lands in the north with a huge army, roughly 10,000 to 15,000 men, 300 ships. He defeats an English force at Fulford, then marches on York. Harold hears this. He's in the south waiting for William, but he reacts instantly. He marches 300 kilometers north in 4 days, insane speed. On 25 September 1066, he surprises Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. The Norwegians are unprepared, many not even armored. It's a hot day. The battle is a massacre. Harold Hardrada is killed by an arrow to the throat, dying on the field. Of 300 ships, only 24 returned to Norway. That was the end of Norwegian Viking invasions, forever. But the story wasn't done. 28 September 1066, while Harold is in the north, William of Normandy lands in the south with 7,000 men. Harold hears and marches back south, another 300 kilometers, in a hurry. 14 October 1066, the Battle of Hastings. The English are exhausted, fresh from victory after a 600-kilometer double march. The fight lasts all day, brutal, close quarters, shield walls. Toward evening, Harold Godwinson is struck by an arrow in the eye. So the legend, the tapestry is ambiguous. He dies. The English line collapses.
William wins. William, a descendant of Rollo the Viking, conquers England. England becomes Norman, French-speaking, feudal. The Vikings conquered England, but they did it as Normans, no longer raiders, but nobles, knights, kings. They won by stopping being Vikings.
We still need to talk about Greenland, because Greenland is a tragedy. Remember, Greenland was settled during the medieval climate optimum, a warm phase. But from 1300 onward came the Little Ice Age. Temperatures fell, glaciers advanced, sea ice spread. For Greenland, catastrophic. Shorter summers, poorer pasture, animals dying. Seafaring grew more dangerous, more ice, more storms. Contact with Iceland and Norway, Greenland's lifeline, broke down. 1410 is the last documented ship to Greenland. After that, nothing. No ships, no traders, no priests. Greenland was cut off. People still lived there for decades, maybe into the 1450s or 80s, but slowly they died out. Why? Climate change. Farming became impossible. Sheep died. Cattle died. Resource scarcity. No timber, no iron, no imports. Isolated gene pool. With only 2,000 to 5,000 people over generations, inbreeding caused genetic issues. Conflicts with the Inuit. Better adapted to the Arctic, the Inuit moved south. Conflict likely occurred. Refusal to adapt. And here's the tragedy. The Norse refused to adopt Inuit technology. They kept building European-style houses, poorly insulated. They kept wearing wool, which fails when wet. They hunted with European methods, inefficient in the Arctic. Archaeology shows the last Greenlanders suffered malnutrition. Their bones showed deficiency markers. They starved, slowly. When European ships returned in the 16th century, they found nothing. Abandoned houses, graves, skeletons. No living Norse. The Greenland Vikings were gone. It's one of the saddest stories of the Viking Age. A society that lasted 500 years and then simply vanished.
The Vikings. From the fjords of Norway to North America. From raiders to kings. What did we learn? Lesson 1. Technology is power. The Vikings dominated Europe for 200 years because they had better ships. Period. Not because they were stronger, not because they were crueler, but because they were more mobile. It's a lesson history teaches again and again. Whoever controls logistics wins. The Mongols had the best horses. The British had the best ships. The Americans had the best aircraft. Technology decides wars. Lesson 2. Adaptation is survival. The Vikings who survived in Normandy, in England, in Russia, were the ones who adapted. They learned the local language. They converted to the local religion. They married local women. The Vikings who died in Greenland were the ones who stayed rigid. They refused to adopt Inuit methods. They clung to a European identity, and they paid with their lives. Arrogance is a deadly trait. Lesson 3. Violence has a half-life. The Vikings started as raiders. They got rich by plundering. But long-term, plunder isn't sustainable. You can loot a village once, then it's empty or defended. But trade is sustainable. Trade generates continuous profits. The Vikings who truly prospered, like the Varangians in Russia, were the ones who shifted from plunder to trade. Violence is a tool, not a business model. Lesson 4. Reputation is currency. The Vikings weren't invincible. They lost battles, they were killed. But their reputation made them more powerful than they really were. The Vikings are coming. That alone often made towns capitulate and pay. Reputation, deserved or not, is a form of power. That's as true today as it was 1,000 years ago. Lesson 5. No one is barbaric. We call the Vikings barbarians, but they weren't primitive. They were brilliant seafarers, skilled merchants, gifted poets, clever diplomats. They had complex laws, a functioning legal system, a rich culture. Yes, they plundered, they enslaved, they killed, but so did the civilized Romans and the Byzantines and the Franks. The Vikings weren't more barbaric than their contemporaries. They were just more successful. And success gets punished with a bad reputation.
What happened to our protagonists? Let's tie up some threads. Normandy. Rollo's descendants conquered England, 1066, southern Italy, 11th century, and played a central role in the Crusades. The Normans became one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. England. The Danelaw was slowly reconquered by Anglo-Saxon kings, but Scandinavian culture remained in law, language, and genes. Modern Britons, especially in the north, have significant Scandinavian ancestry. Russia. Kievan Rus became the foundation of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Varangians vanished as a distinct group by the 12th century, but their legacy of statehood and trade networks remained. Scandinavia. The Scandinavian kingdoms became stable, Christian states. The Viking Age was forgotten or romanticized. Only in the 19th century, with the rise of nationalism, did the Vikings become popular again. Iceland. Iceland stayed independent until 1262, when it came under Norwegian rule. It kept its unique culture and language. Modern Icelandic is closer to Old Norse than any other living language. Greenland. The Norse settlements died out. The Inuit remained. Greenland was later resettled by Danes and is today an autonomous part of Denmark.
Statistical look back. Some numbers to grasp the scale. Estimated population of Scandinavia in the 9th century, 500,000 to 1 million. Estimated number of Vikings, active raiders and traders at any given time, maybe 10,000 to 30,000, a small minority. Estimated slaves traded through Scandinavian networks, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands over 200 years. Deaths from Viking raids? Impossible to estimate, certainly tens of thousands, maybe more.
Number of Arab coins found in Scandinavia, over 85,000. Number of documented Viking raids, hundreds, likely many unrecorded. Distance from Norway to Newfoundland, approximately 4,500 kilometers in open boats. That last one is really mind-blowing.
A final reflection. The Vikings fascinate us because they embody all the contradictions of human nature. They were brutal, but also poetic. They were raiders, but also merchants. They were pagans, and then Christians. They were outsiders, and became kings. They show us that identity is fluid. The Vikings weren't a static group. They changed. They adapted. They became whatever they had to be in order to survive. And ultimately, they survived by stopping being Vikings. Is that tragedy or success? Maybe both.
That's it, the Vikings, in all their bloody, fascinating, contradictory glory. I hope you learned something, or at least found something to think about. Maybe you now see these people differently, not as caricatures, horned barbarians, but as humans. Complicated, ambitious, often brutal, but also creative and adaptable. They changed Europe. They founded states that still exist. They reached America, and then forgot it. They weren't the heroes they're often made out to be, but they weren't monsters either. They were people in a brutal time. And that, I think, is the most important lesson.
Bonus section: Common myths about Vikings. Before we go, let's quickly bust a few stubborn myths. Myth 1. Vikings wore horned helmets. No. Just no. We've said it already, but it bears repeating. Not a single Viking Age horned helmet has ever been found. The idea comes from the 19th century, popularized mainly by Wagner. Why would no one wear horns in battle? Because it's tactically idiotic. A sword hits the horn, transfers force into your skull. Hello, concussion. Horned helmets existed in the Bronze Age, 1,500 years earlier, as ritual objects, not for combat. But horned Vikings sell better, so the myth sticks. Myth 2. Vikings were all blonde and gigantic. Partly true, partly false. Yes, many Scandinavians were blonde and tall compared to Southern Europeans. But genetics show dark-haired Vikings existed, and redheads. Eric the Red, anyone? Average male height, about 1.70 meters or 5.7 feet. Not short, but not the mountain either. Sorry to ruin the fantasy. Myth 3. Vikings were dirty and unkempt. Opposite is true. Vikings were obsessed with hygiene and appearance. Archaeology, combs, tweezers, ear spoons, razors in almost every grave. A 10th century Arab observer, Ibn Fadlan, complained that Vikings washed every day. Every day. In a century when most Europeans bathed maybe once a week, if that. English chronicles grumbled that Scandinavian men looked too good and charmed English women. The Vikings were literally too attractive, a political problem. Myth 4. Vikings drank from skulls. No, that's a mistranslation. An Old Norse poem says warriors drank from the curved branches of skulls. That's a kenning, a poetic metaphor. It means horns. They drank from horns, not skulls. Fair enough, there are a few reports of skull cups made from enemies, but that was rare and ritual, not standard. Myth 5. All Vikings were warriors. No. Most Scandinavians were farmers, raising livestock, growing small amounts of grain, and fishing. Only a small percentage actually went raiding. Viking was, as we said, a seasonal job. Summer, raid. Winter, mind the farm. Medieval version of
Summer I bartend in Ibiza. Myth 6. Vikings were uneducated. False. They had a rich oral culture. Skaldic poetry was sophisticated and complex. They had runes, not a full literary script, but fine for inscriptions, marks, and magic. Once Christianized, they adopted the Latin alphabet fast. The Icelandic sagas, 12th century, are among the most literarily refined works of the Middle Ages. The Vikings weren't uneducated, they were educated differently. Myth 7. Women played no role. False. Viking women had more rights than most medieval women. They could own property, file for divorce, in some cases even fight. Shield maiden evidence is debated, but there are hints. Famous case, a grave at Birka, Sweden, long known as a warrior grave, full of weapons and strategy gaming pieces, suggesting command. DNA analysis, 2017, it was a woman. Does that mean women fought regularly? Probably not. But it means it happened.
Final thoughts. The Vikings fascinate because they tell us something about ourselves. They show how people under extreme conditions, poverty, overpopulation, scarce resources, find solutions. Sometimes brutal, sometimes brilliant. They show how identity changes, how Vikings became Normans, how Northmen became Russians. They show that history is never simple, never black and white. The Vikings were victims of circumstance, born into a poor, harsh land. But they were also perpetrators, enslaving, murdering, plundering. They were explorers, reaching America 500 years before Columbus. But they were also short-sighted, dying in Greenland because they refused to learn. They were, in other words, human. And that may be the most important insight. History isn't about heroes and villains. It's about people, with all their strengths and weaknesses, their wins and failures. The Vikings were neither saints nor monsters. They were people, trying to survive in a brutal world. And sometimes they won, and sometimes they lost, like all of us.
Let me end with a line from the Halvamal, Sayings of the High One, wisdom attributed to Odin. Cattle die, and kinsmen die, and so one dies oneself. One thing now that never dies, the fame of a dead man's deeds. In other words, your reputation outlives you. The Vikings have been dead for 1,000 years, but their reputation, fair or not, lives on. And maybe that is their greatest achievement.
If you enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, comment if you have questions or disagree. And especially, if you think more people should hear stories like this, share the video. History isn't dead. It lives in us, in our languages, our genes, our institutions. The Vikings vanished 1,000 years ago, but their legacy is everywhere. And above all, stay curious, stay critical, and most of all, stay human. See you next time.